Perfectionist Musicians Podcast. Take action to find healthy perfectionism. Discussions about the background of successful careers in music performance, arts and science.
In the first episode of The Perfectionist, my conversation with Dr. Brigitte Salonen, flautist and body mapping educator, we touched upon the importance of understanding the value of slow practice, the value of gradually developing and acquiring new skills and integrating them. Also, we talked about how working with mindfulness and self-regulation ability help musicians in achieving more in their practice. If you missed the first episode, you can listen to it by clicking on the link below in the description. Also, I have put there the link for the Body Mapping Education website, where you can read a lot more about this method, which is specifically developed for musicians. In today's episode, we will summarize the great outcomes when musicians use their mind and body appropriately. Brigitte also presents an example of how a coincidence of events and circumstances can lead musicians to experience severe health issues. And finally, Brigitte will list the most important tools of effective practicing. Brigitte, welcome back. In the first episode, you mentioned that perfectionism might be better replaced by excellence. Also, we started talking about how teachers can support musicians. So, what will you say to that?
I think it's just important that one moves gradually away from this emphasis on perfection, because the goal of perfection as a performing artist is a dangerous one because it's elusive. So I think perhaps another issue which I think is important to look at is, how does one as a music teacher look at these psychological issues in their music students, in their practice as music teachers, and what are the aspects to be aware of? And I think what's important here is that if we would talk about this whole question of psychological issues in a music teaching practice, I think it's important just to acknowledge that psychological aspects are part of musicianship. They are part of performance. They are part of one's attitudes to practice, part of one's attitudes to achievement, to one's sense of identity, to one's passion, one's sense of purpose. So, in fact, one could even more broadly say it's the musician's self-concept as an artist. And in fact, does the musician conceive of themselves as an artist? And if they do, to what extent? And if they don't, why don't they? You know, these issues will make a big difference to how one's body feels physically.
Can I make a little comment about this? Yeah. All this list you made now, ending up with the musician self-concept. In my own PhD, I was doing a regression analysis, so I predicted performance anxiety and perfectionism by musician self-concept, and the connection, the link between these two is incredible, it's huge. I define self-concept as the person who is a musician sees himself or herself as a musician. So as a musician, I have high self-esteem. Second, on a scale from 1 to 10, as a performer, I rate myself as a 6 or 10 or whatever. And what is my ideal and what is my realistic rating? So I was counting it as a gap. So there was a huge gap, means there's a lot of dissatisfaction about the realistic performance ability. And also I measured self-concept as the personal self-esteem. So as a person, I have high self-esteem. And how much does it bother you that your ideal and realistic, that you perceive the performance level is not the same? And the regression showed that 55% or 50% of the variance was explained.
Wow. So the whole perfectionism thing is huge. I mean, I know it is.
Yeah. So when a teacher can help a musician is not directly talk about reducing perfectionism. In my opinion, and from the interviews I did with musicians and from trainers who would deal with people who experience anxiety or perfectionism, is just to tell them that accept whoever you are at the moment, what you know, what you don't know, that's fine. Who you are as you are, that's fine. And this acceptance helps to calm down. And I think actually all the mindfulness and everything that we talked about, the relaxed bodily practice, I think it is linked to acceptance.
Yes.
When you don't force it, where you don't want to be somewhere else where you are at the moment.
Exactly.
So, as a teacher, as an accomplished flautist, how do you integrate the psychological and physiological aspect of musicianship in your practice?
I feel that being qualified in body mapping and using my body mapping in my teaching practice allows me to work more holistically with my musician student. I can address aspects like movement quality, tension, body awareness, and posture, and so on. And then these in turn will support enhanced well being, more confident performance, a sense of achievement, a sense of self acceptance, a more positive psychology in general, better self regulation, enhanced feeling of embodiment, both the musician student feeling physically more present and more embodied, and also feeling more musically embodied. It gives them more agency, and so on. I could go on. There are more things, but I think that's where that integration happens.
What differences can be noticed when musicians are using their body appropriately while playing or singing? So, what are the negative outcomes of improper bodily use in the performance?
So I think I'm going to answer that question in the positive. So what positive differences can be noticed? And then we don't need to answer the negative because it will obviously be the opposite of that. So I think what is noticed is greater freedom in both the technical and musical aspect of performance. And that leads to a freedom of expression and more connection to the music. So what we see more comfortable playing. We see and hear more expressive and authentic performances. The results are also in terms of more virtuosic technique, better control, easier projection, and also more engagement with the audience because this freedom of expression leads to a confidence in communication.
Is it because the attention of the musician goes somewhere else? The focus is placed upon something else? What do you think?
I think it's because the musician can integrate the musical and technical aspects with their body. And I think that integration allows everything to happen so much more easily.
I'm just trying to imagine that what exactly is happening in the person's mind and of course in the body as well. How do you direct yourself? How do you direct your focus and attention and your body when you are more integrated and you aim for integration?
I think that is that process I spoke about in the beginning of our interview,
Mm-hmm.
which is that gradual process of skill acquisition. And
Mm-hmm.
it has to be gradual because it can easily be a bit overwhelming in the beginning, especially if the person has a tendency to being over analytical and over detailed and trying to do too many things at the same time. I think the teacher has to be conscious of guiding the student step by step so that the skill acquisition is gradual and that it becomes a fluid process of integrating the movement quality and awareness and embodiment with the technical and musical aspects of playing. I think that it's highly individual. Everybody comes from a completely different set of perceptions and needs and skills. So I think it's very individual how that integration happens. Some people will just take to it. Other people, it might be initially quite an emotional experience for them. For example, I had a highly qualified person would come to me for work on persistent issues in their arm and shoulder. and hand, which was now affecting their playing to the extent that they were concerned they would need to stop. And in gradually working with this musician client, it became clear that the issue was actually from the position of the head and neck, which was causing compression in the cervical vertebra, the nerves in the neck, in the spine. And this was causing numbness in the fingers and tingling sensations in the arm and lack of control, in technical control, because the fingers couldn't feel properly, the lack of sensation, the numbness. And then when we worked further with her, we actually found that there was major issue with jaw and tongue tension whilst playing. But of course, she didn't have the agency or the resources to know what to do, you know. And this person, for example, had to relearn embouchure and position of the jaw and the tongue because it was completely incorrect. So she had to start from like a beginner again with embouchure. And she also had to learn to be more self-empowered. Her previous style of teaching that she had received was a very autocratic teacher. So it was that teacher's way, no other way. So here is an example of an adult young professional who had problems in her playing physiologically and technically, which were not addressed, and who had been seeing a physiotherapist repeatedly to try to fix these problems in her hand, wrist, and forearm and shoulder, even though the physiotherapist had said to her, I think this problem is coming from compression of the nerves in your neck. The physiotherapist couldn't fix it, and her teacher just said to her, just relax, just you're not practicing properly, just practice properly, whatever. You know, that all these issues depend on the context of the music student and the type of teaching style and environment that they're in.
I'm wondering, how can musicians overcome difficulties and turn around the downward spiral? I mean that they would experience worse and worse bodily symptoms, which of course affect their musicianship. So how can musicians change themselves in their overall practice?
So the musician has to be very, very accepting and very brave and very, very open, very, so it's a big area of self-acceptance and so on, and just managing the trauma in a way of the situation. It's a trauma for them. They need a team of people around them, friends, family, professionals, and me just as a body mapping and musician's health practitioner. I always make sure that my musician client has that. So it can be a different type of team around every individual, but they need a team of people around them, and they need that support, professional and otherwise, and multidisciplinary. And it's a gradual process.
You mentioned a particular case, which I think will be very useful, as it might be a reconciliation for those who had similar experiences in their studentships. Many of the musicians I interviewed for my PhD mentioned at least one odd story with their teacher. So I wonder how musicians integrate those new skills they discover by working with you.
Having worked with a number of musician clients with different issues that needed rehabilitation or recovery from, it has shown me how different and personal each situation is, and how different the emotional reactions and ability to integrate the new information is, and how long it can take or not, and what needs to be done. I think each situation is so individual that it's quite hard to answer your question in a specific way. Like your question was, how does one integrate these skills?
I accept it because I don't have any experience. What I know from experience that when I was teaching beginner violinists, they needed all different methods. So I was adjusting my skills and plans to them. So it
Yeah,
wasn't like a curricula for violin. It didn't work.
exactly.
Never would have worked.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's the same kind of thing. It's hard to answer a question about how do musicians integrate this information to become more free in their playing. I think it's really personal, and it once again links up with those psychological aspects. Yeah, I mean, some people and also it depends on things, even like financial stress. You know, some people are in a hurry because of financial stress and financial needs. Other people don't have that.
Does it mean that instrumentalists would not seek help due to financial issues?
A lot of the musicians are what we call self-reliant. In other words, they just try and fix themselves, and then they go to Dr. Google or Dr. Facebook or Dr. wherever, and they don't actually get the correct advice. It's really good to know, to encourage musicians to learn about prevention, to learn about educating themselves, to know where the right sources of help are, and to work with people like myself who are the kind of interface between music education and medical professionals. That's where I see my place. I can operate in both worlds. I can operate in a medical team helping somebody. I can understand all the medical notes and diagnostics and x-rays and things. And then I can also then work in the music education and performance setting, either helping someone with rehabilitation or giving preventative education. So I'm kind of that interface in between.
But sometimes it happens, as you just said, that the doctor and the physiotherapist couldn't help, but you were the
Yes.
one who detected the origin of the issue.
Yeah, so that's why one needs collaboration between music educators, musicians, music students, medical professionals, and health professionals. Music teachers and musicians don't take these things into their own hands, that they do make sure they get the correct support and advice. And the model that I always propose is a collaborative and interdisciplinary model of support for musicians.
In the first episode of the Perfectionist podcast, we touched upon the topic of practicing. I really wanted to ask you, what is good practicing, and can you suggest good practicing methods for instrumentalists and for vocalists?
That's a big question. I think that's another whole podcast all on its own, actually.
Briefly,
because
and we will come back to it.
because I must say, in the musicians performance health course that I taught, it ran for a whole semester. This was what I did as part of my PhD study, was actually teaching a comprehensive course. And there was one entire module on practice methods. One has to be careful of oversimplifying that. I think there are just so many layers and levels of efficient practice. You know, the main one, I suppose, would be slow, deep, mindful practice. That would be the main one. I think
Okay.
the second one would be having goals in your practice and know what you're working towards. The other issue would be to identify in your practice what you actually want to fix and what you want to improve on. Because if you haven't identified that, then how do you know what to actually practice and work on? Another aspect might be to have short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals, to know where you'd like to be in a year, to know where you'd like to be in a few months, and to know actually what you want to accomplish from this very practice session right now, today. The other thing would be to vary the focus of what you practice, to make sure that you're covering a number of different issues. Another good tool would be to record yourself, to video yourself, and watch those videos so that you can perhaps see and hear things that you weren't aware of. Another good tool would be to use a mirror. Another good tool would be to take breaks in practicing so that you don't ever practice too long and too intensely without actually stopping, having a physical and mental break, which is obviously very important for injury prevention, but also it's important for giving yourself time to reflect on what you were doing, whether you achieved what you set out to do, how much you achieved, how much more you want to achieve, whether you want to stop and try it again tomorrow, whether you want to practice something completely different for a while, and so on. So it gives you time for reflection and evaluation of what you've been doing.
I truly believe that practicing methods and tools must be taught by each instrumental and vocal teacher. The situation in music schools, I think, is way better than it used to be about 20 years ago. But I was just thinking that even though we are taught how to practice in the right way, is it really enough?
Emisha, what I always say to my students is, you know, guys, you spend 1 hour a week with me. How many hours do you spend practicing in a good week? And they will say, Oh, about 20 to 25 hours. And I say, great. So, which one is going to win the battle in changing your habits and cementing in your technique and musical knowledge and everything? Is it me for 1 hour a week, or is it what you do with yourself for 25 hours a week or even 20 hours a week? And so, of course, then they very quickly understand that whatever they do in practice, good or bad, they will learn. The body will learn. So if it's negative thinking patterns for 25 hours in the week, the body will learn that. So if it's positive thinking patterns for 25 hours in the week, the body will learn that. Or if it's a balance of challenge and effort and acceptance and inspiration, then the body remembers the good things and remembers the balance. So I always try to teach a lot of stuff to do with autonomy and independent learning and regulation and so on, because it's actually not about me, it's about me enabling them.
What you said makes me assume that mindful playing combined with being aware of the use of the body can lead to better performances.
I think what would be the most important answer to that is that body awareness becomes part of musical expression and musical technique. And so the musician combines their musical intention. They must start with a clear musical intention. Often that is missing, so that must be there. And often they forget about this. If there is a clear musical intention, that will then drive a clear movement intention, which then leads to the bodily connectedness or embodiment and that feeling of ease and that facilitation of self expression.
I see. So we touched upon a lot of topics, and thank you so much for being part of this. And I'm hoping to have you back once about talking mental practice, and second, on a different podcast, I really would like to know and learn more about general, effective, healthy musical practice and practicing.
Thank you very much, Emesha. It's been a pleasure to chat to you today.
So that was the second part of the discussion I had with Dr. Bridget Salonen, flautist and body mapping educator. In the next episode, 2 weeks from now, I will introduce you a clinical psychologist who specializes in musicians' performance anxiety. And if you have questions that interest you or you would like to learn more about a certain topic, please share with me, and any requests you have, put it in a comment below, and I will make sure that I will address them in a different podcast in the future. And until the next episode, remember, done is better than perfect.